The objective of these lectures is to give you a practical understanding of JavaScript as a programming language so that you can more easily learn specialized frameworks and libraries later as needed. So we're going to start with what is JavaScript, then why learn the fundamentals of the JavaScript language, and finally learning the fundamentals via a bunch of code examples. What I really want to focus on in these lectures is just that JavaScript is a normal programming language. It's just a language. It's kind of similar to Python. It's obviously not identical, but if you're familiar with a language like Python, JavaScript is similar in many ways. So when many people think of JavaScript, they think of JavaScript running in a web browser. So every web browser runs JavaScript natively. So if you open up a console in the web browser, you can just start typing in JavaScript code like let x equals hello or console log x plus world to print hello world. Web pages will load JavaScript to implement dynamic functionality. It's what's usually associated with web browsers. But increasingly now, JavaScript is now being run on servers as well. And servers are just ordinary computers. So there's a program called Node.js that allows JavaScript to be run on the command line on any computer. So if you just type Node and you have it installed, it opens a console for you where you can just start typing JavaScript code. This is very similar to a language like Python or Ruby, where you can just type Python or Ruby and just start typing code on the command line. So this is where JavaScript is being used a bunch as well. It's also starting to be used for native mobile apps to build mobile applications and compile them to their native runtimes. But that's less common. So most of all, we're going to focus on the browser and the server. Now, when people are talking about JavaScript or learning JavaScript, oftentimes it's a bit overwhelming because when people show code examples of learning JavaScript, it's often intermingled with, say, the web browser's API in the browser, which allows you to do things like selecting and modifying the DOM elements on the web page, setting handlers for, say, mouse clicks or keyboard presses and stuff. Those are all part of the web browser's API. They're not part of the core JavaScript language as a programming language per se. And then on top of the web browser API, people have built some convenience libraries like jQuery. So you might see JavaScript code examples that use a $sign. So that's a lot of jQuery functions that are, again, specially made for jQuery, and they don't necessarily have to do with the language as a whole. Even more complex are these front-end web frameworks. Right now, really popular ones include Angular, React, and Vue. These web frameworks are kind of like domain-specific languages that are built on top of JavaScript, and oftentimes transforms JavaScript into kind of a domain-specific language that doesn't even look fully like JavaScript. So like it can become really overwhelming to try to learn, React, for example, if you don't even know the base programming language JavaScript, because you have to learn a lot of kind of React-specific things or Angular-specific things. On the server end, there's what's called Node.js, which provides an API for working with web servers, for doing stuff like opening connections to a socket, opening connections to the local file system, interacting with the operating system in various ways. And on top of Node.js, people have built backend web frameworks. Express is one of the more popular ones for building web application backends. And then there are also database APIs and connected databases like MySQL, MongoDB, or a bunch of other databases. So like when people talk about learning JavaScript, oftentimes they're mixing up a lot of different things in one, like whether it's things in the browser or browser or front-end frameworks or things on the server with Node.js or back-end frameworks and stuff. It all gets really confusing. But what I really want to focus on in these lectures is the top red box, JavaScript as a programming language by itself. So the note is that new libraries and frameworks crop up every month, and it's impossible to keep up with the latest developments. It's going to be a losing battle if you keep on trying to learn new frameworks and new libraries all the time. But the thing that stays in common and that's relatively stable is the programming language JavaScript, which is above, right? The base core programming language. And that's what I want to cover in these lectures. Because I believe that having a good understanding of the language itself will give you confidence when you're working with any framework or environment that you might encounter in the future. And that's why I really want to focus on the core language. And we're going to spend several lectures here on JavaScript language fundamentals for this reason. Now, this may be a review for some of you. So for those of you who have done JavaScript programming, some of this stuff might start off a bit slow. But I found that even really experienced web developers have pretty big gaps in their understanding of fundamentals, and that leads them to be tripped up later on and when they're trying to learn more advanced things. So I think having a really strong grasp of the fundamentals is really critical. Okay, so the question is, we're going to learn JavaScript, the core language, but what should we learn? So JavaScript actually has a really interesting, very colorful, drama-filled history since it came out over 2 decades ago in 1995. There's a lot of complexity and disagreements about what language features to use to still support older web browsers. Because the fact of the matter is that there's a lot of really old web browsers out there that people still use that are running an older version of JavaScript. So if you are writing and using the newest language features, they might not actually work on the older browsers. And there's all sorts of workarounds and hacks around that. But for the sake of simplicity and teaching fundamentals, we're going to learn the latest version, which is commonly called ES6, and it was released around 2015. So about 3 years ago from when I'm making these lectures. And, there are some newer versions that are coming down the pipeline, but this version is, has some fairly big changes to the older versions. And it seems like it's fairly stable at this point relatively. And we're going to loosely follow the coding style guides from Google and Airbnb. So these are 2 companies that have invested a lot of effort in writing style guides for best practices for how to write your JavaScript code. Now, of course, these are just guides. They're not absolute rules. So we're not going to follow everything to a T, but they're good to have to see kind of conventions for how major players in the JavaScript space are approaching using the language features. The prerequisites for these lectures that I'm assuming you already have a fair amount of programming experience from prior classes and or jobs. So this is not an introduction to programming. This should not be your first exposure. Also, I'm assuming you've seen some JavaScript before. You've done some web programming, again, in prior classes or jobs. So it's not your first time seeing any JavaScript code. So I'm going to cover the subset of JavaScript that you're most likely to encounter in practice as a novice or intermediate level full stack web developer on both the browser and the client and on the server. In order to illustrate a lot of how JavaScript works under the hood, I created a visualizer. It's called the Python Tutor, but it actually works on JavaScript as well. You can see the link here, and I'm going to be using it to demonstrate the features. So if you go to pythontutor.com, you can actually play with it live. The only thing I ask is don't use it during lecture itself, because the server might crash if hundreds of students are using it at once. It probably can't handle the load.